Hello and welcome to today's free live session based around lots of conversations we've been having with our dietitians alongside lots happening in the marketing space and the hydration market in particular. We thought we would spend today talking through electrolytes and just clarifying a few things, ensuring that you're feeling really confident in all things electrolytes and acknowledging when you might need them, but also being able to advocate for your clients and your athletes of when they maybe don't need them as well. Because I guess a big thing around, particularly the social media space, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of opinion, but there's also a lot of consumer bias and bias within the marketing too, because even in the dietitian space, I've noticed that some dietitians are shareholders of certain hydration companies or sponsored in that way. And they don't always declare it, which is really, really frustrating. So a lot of the information coming from some experts alongside a lot of influencers can be really convoluted and really, really tricky to work through. So all things electrolytes today. Obviously, we can cover a bit of the science today, but I wanted to also cover a bit of the logistics and considerations when you're talking to clients about electrolytes, because there's a part of this that can be really positive in terms of improved hydration and recovery. But there's also a piece of like, how can we save them money? How can we reduce, health risk and ensure that their intake of electrolytes isn't exceeding, how much they actually need for health and also performance and recovery. So let's start with the basics, guys. Review of the science. Electrolytes are minerals. So you've got your vitamins and minerals. Electrolytes are the mineral side. And if you think about the name of electrolytes, it gives you a hint of what they actually do. Electric. They hold an electric charge. And that electric charge then leads us into what they actually do and how they help us to function. One part of that is absolutely fluid balance in terms of helping fluid across and into cells and outside cells. But also what they do is in all things like muscle function, contractions, nerve signaling, and overall muscle fatigue and those types of things. So electrolytes do have a place and they're very essential for our body and our bodily function. And therefore, that is why we generally want to make sure that we've got electrolytes coming in through fluid, but also we're going to get electrolytes through our food as well. So all this hopefully is a review, but I thought let's start from the start. Sorry, I'm overheating in here and it's really hot in this room. Anyway, back to chatting. Minerals and what electrolytes are, they're things like your sodium, magnesium, potassium, chloride. Have I forgotten anything? Calcium. And they will be in varying amounts in hydration drinks for that reason. Are they needed? How much is needed? Let's clarify this in the next half hour. Let's see if I can cover it in half hour, considering my waffle. So when are they useful? Let's start on the positive side. There are some brilliant papers and recently published papers that I highly recommend going through, reading, and really just reviewing. And I can link those into this recording within the YouTube clip as well to ensure that you feel really comfortable with that. Because I think it has been overstated how important electrolytes are and how much we actually need and how often we might need them. Really, when we're looking at when a client might need electrolytes in the sports setting, there's a few clear reasons. Obviously, there's the hydration and rehydration piece, particularly in high risk environments. So that might be really hot and humid environments in particular, where sweat is the main escape of the heat, but also the main way the body wants to cool. But also it might be that they're wearing really heavy clothes or a lot of clothing where sweat again is a really heavy, you're going to lose a lot of those electrolytes through that sweat. The other piece in sport where we really do want to see it probably be used is, for example, in really long endurance events. Over 3-4 plus hours, particularly in those long events where you're like going to be replacing more than 75 to 80% of your fluid losses. That is when we do want to start getting electrolytes in. And even in the shorter events, say your client is only going for 1 or 2 hours, if they're planning to replace pretty much all or more of their losses in fluid during that event, you want to have some electrolytes in there to reduce the risk of hyperhydrating and going into hyponatremia. So there's a few different things there. And obviously that's not all the time. In normal training day, small events, short events, electrolytes aren't really necessary. The reason why we might put them in also in the sporting context is to hyperhydrate. So that's a really set protocol probably a conversation for another day in terms of heating and cooling and those things. And we did cover that a little bit in the heat specific session that we did, if you want to go back. We might put electrolytes in and high salt concentrations in to hyperhydrate the cells going into a high intensity session, long session, or a really high risk session where there might be really heavy losses, say really hot, really humid environments. We might also look at electrolytes after, where there's been a dehydration experience where they might have lost more than 2 to 3% of their body weight, and that rehydration in that short amount of time is paramount and really high priority. Electrolytes can help to replace those losses, but also hold those losses in, because you've got sodium and water that are best friends in the body, and they do stick together, and you do hold that water better. That's not to say that water is a waste of time, though, which is sometimes what is shared in social media land, which makes me it just gives me the heebie-jeebies, because how did we get to this point where people were actually convinced that water is a waste of time and doesn't hydrate you? I do not know. But they're like the really clear things. The other piece, I guess, which is a little bit more niche in the sporting context, is making weight and hydration in the short turnaround that you've got between weighing and then competing. Because generally when you're weighing in, you're in a dehydrated state to make weight. Hydration via added electrolytes can be really, really useful. A lot of the time that's also going to be done through sports drink as well, to try and refuel by the carbohydrates in that as well, which we'll cover a little bit in a sec. So there's some key things there. The other piece in the general population of where we might see electrolytes useful, whether you're working with athletes or not, is if someone's really unwell and they're losing a whole lot of fluids and unable to get enough fluids in. So things like gastro with your vomiting and diarrhea in particular is a really clear example there. The other time is where they might have a really physical job that is in the heat and humidity with really high losses of sweat sodium, but also just sweat in general. Can be a really clear reason to use that. Or they might just have really high hydration needs, or they're finding it hard to keep up with hydration. You can add electrolytes in. But if someone's just at the desk all day doing maybe half hour to an hour of training per day, not a high risk environment, very unlikely that electrolytes are going to help at all. And I think a lot of the time when we're getting that feedback from clients or social media and messaging, it's like, electrolytes just made me feel so much better. I was concentrating better. I was focused. I was able to make decisions, those types of things. I'm wondering if they were just better hydrated in the way of like they actually drank water because they enjoyed it more. And it was the water that did that, not actually the electrolytes. So I think internally we can challenge those things and notice them, but also it's important to validate the client of like, that is so interesting. I love that you had that experience. Let's unpack what maybe created that so that we can repeat it and find a better way where it's more sustainable. Maybe it's cheaper as well, but it's also looking after their health. Because I think a lot of the time, the use of electrolytes and the prolific use of electrolytes that's continuing to expand and grow, I think is related to it tasting better than water. And so you're more likely to drink enough, drink more, and therefore you feel better and it works. But I don't know if it's just the electrolytes. I think it's actually just that they're better hydrated. And if that's the case and it's just habit stacking in a way of going, I need to make this easier and more enjoyable for my client, what are other things you can use to flavor that water to ensure that they are hydrating well, continuing to hydrate well without adding extra sodium into their intake, which is probably based around the average person's intake on a daily basis already high enough or even too high. So just like as a little background as well, and why we don't need to replace electrolytes to the extent that maybe the marketing tells us to do, is that when we dehydrate, the sodium concentration in our blood actually increases in the way of the concentration increases. We don't get more sodium in, but what we do is have a higher concentration of sodium in the blood as a dehydrated state. Our body then pulls that water from the internal, like the intracellular fluid, into the extracellular fluid to improve our hydration, but we also wee less, we get thirsty, and our body has that kind of response. But when also we sweat when we're dehydrated, but also when we're trying to cool ourselves, our body doesn't sweat to the same concentration of sodium that we have in our blood. So it's not like, oh, well, I need this much sodium because that's how much is in my blood. That's not how things work. There's lots of protection as the fluid leaves our cells to protect the sodium and keep it in our body. And also on top of that, if you're working with someone who is actually really quite acclimatized to the heat or humidity they're in, they're going to be really efficient sweaters, and they're going to sweat a lot to improve their heat. And that's what their body has been trained to do, whether they're just an average person or an athlete. But also in efficient sweating, they lose a lot of fluid, but their body is excellent at protecting their electrolytes. So they actually need less, or need to replace less than maybe you would assume, even though they're sweating a lot. So I guess that's probably like just a little background as well in terms of the science of like, we probably don't need it that much. The other thing, I guess, is like, even if you know that we probably don't need it that much, and working with a client, you're like, oh, they're having too much, or they're having this when they don't need it. Don't step into fixing or breaking that rapport or telling them they're wrong early. Really weigh up of, is this actually a problem? And if it's a problem, is it a small problem or a big problem? And do I step in and try and fix straight away and tell them they're wrong and that they should be doing different, or they don't need to do it? Or do I let them continue doing that as we build rapport and focus on the big problems first and let this one sit? I think what we try and do often is we jump into the science with our clients, we try and fix, we try and help, and sometimes that breaks rapport because we lose trust before we've even got it. So really weighing up, is it actually a problem? And if it's a problem, is it a big problem or a small problem? And then you can decide whether you act upon that then, or if it's a later thing to cover in a future session, depending on the priority. I think that's most of like when you would use it. Just need a drink of water. In terms of practical considerations, one thing that I was doing, and I have this amazing chart that I've started and have not finished around where all the different electrolyte products sit in sodium concentration. And it is wild. Like, you are probably all aware, the people I'm talking to, of how wild west the supplement company is, and the supplement industry is. And when you're comparing the concentration of sodium in a hydration product, I don't think there's no better way to show how wild it is, because some of the products out there are pretty much just flavored water with a useless amount of sodium. And there's other products out there that are absolutely horrifically high in sodium, to the point where I would say they're quite dangerous and not hydrating at all. And so when we're looking at how much sodium you would want in a product for your client, if we go off millimole per litre, which is generally where the recommendations sit, but I appreciate that the labels say milligrams per litre, so I'll do both. You want at least 20 millimole per litre of sodium in a fluid to start the rehydration or improve hydration compared to just water. In an oral rehydration solution, in terms of the clinical setting, or like the clinical definition of oral rehydration, you'll find that, oh, sorry, I didn't convert. I promised you I'd convert. 20 millimolar per litre is around 400 to 500 milligrams per litre of sodium as a concentration. But in terms of the oral rehydration, I'll go back, like your hydrolytes and those clinical formulas that are designed for rehydration and clinical rehydration purposes, they sit around 60 to 80 millimole per litre of sodium. And they vary a little bit, but around that range. And that's where you probably want to sit if you're really focusing on replacing those electrolytes. And that's what you would generally find in those types of products. And that's around that anywhere from about 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams per litre of sodium per litre. Sorry. So like, just as a guide, you're kind of wanting at least 500 milligrams per litre, anywhere till about like that 1,500 milligrams per litre. It's a really big range, but it depends on why you want it. Are you after just a little bit of flavouring and just a hydration strategy that tastes better? And if so, go the lower. But if it's a oral rehydration for clinical purposes, like illness, for example, you want to go that higher end. If you've done a sweat test and you know that sodium losses are quite high in your client, you can absolutely go a higher option as well, but you can also use things like salt tablets and those types of things depending on their preference. And that kind of gets me into sweat testing. Is it worthwhile? Should I be doing it? I was very fortunate to be the sweat testing bitch at AIS when I worked there. And that would mean that people around Australia would do sweat testing on their athletes and send me the patches. How lovely. I got sweat sent to me. But over time, the more testing we did, the more we realized there was a whole lot of user error. So much user error. What was the point? Because I couldn't even give people feedback because the patch had been in the wrong section of the tube and not enough sweat was collected and all these types of things. It was just a mess, and it was just a real frustrating part of my role, to be honest. But also on top of that, we didn't really have clear recommendations based around those findings of what to do then, of like, okay, well, the sweat sodium is this much, so therefore do this much. We had estimates and we kind of played around with it, but was it evidence-based? Maybe not, maybe evidence informed to a point, but it wasn't really practical. The other piece to that as well is like the cost to it and sweat concentrations in terms of sweat electrolyte concentrations like sodium change depending on where that patch is on the body. So how much sodium you lose, say if you're measuring sweat from your forehead, is different to your arm, to your leg, to your tummy, whatever it may be, and your back. So it depended on where that patch was and averaging out over the body and all these types of things. And that was only a piece of it. Sweat sodium, as we mentioned, also changes in terms of fitness and acclimatization. So you might measure an athlete and go, okay, your sweat sodium is this much, your sweat rate is this much. But a month later, that could be completely different. So it was a real changing science. It was a data point at one point in time, and it really limited the practicality of doing that. There are really clear options, particularly in like really high risk environments and high reward possibility environments of like that top end of performance where you may consider doing a sweat test. Or if someone is planning on doing an event for a really long time and you really need to calculate very well to replace and make sure we replenish, there are times where maybe a sweat test would be worthwhile adding a data point to your planning. But for most individuals, it wouldn't be something I would recommend for that reason. The other thing probably to like mention, and it's been in the news a bit, so maybe like media wise, it's kind of in vogue, is B6 toxicity. Now, B6 is an interesting one. It's a water soluble vitamin, as you know. I'm talking to people who already know this stuff. So in your head, you might be like, well, you can't get an overdose from B6 because there's no toxicity. You weed out if you have too much. The interesting piece is that is true with B6 from food, but B6 from supplements has a quite a high half-life of 20 to 30 days. So if you've got a client who is having hydration drinks that can have B6 added, plus supplements with B6 added, things like your multivitamins and a few other energy-based supplements, it can be quite easy to go over your B6 threshold because B6 is actually quite a small amount per day as an RDI. And this is particularly true in your kids and your adolescent athletes in particular, just adolescents in particular. So just be really aware that if you are recommending or asking someone about their electrolyte, it's really important to ask about the brand that they're having so that you can investigate what other additions are in that electrolyte and whether they are also taking other supplements, because it can come about in terms of neural pathway and neural symptoms. And it's something just to be really aware of both in the athlete population, but also in the general population. Because there are some supplements out there that are extremely high in B6. So just as a FYI, keep it on your radar. What was another thing I wrote down? Batch testing is a question I get a lot around electrolytes. It would be what we consider a low risk supplement and a sports food a lot of the time. And so your role as a sports dietitian or dietitian in this way is just protecting and going safety first with your athletes and your clients, and educating them on what the difference is between third-party batch tested and not, educating them on where the risk is and what's packaged with that particular supplement or supplement brand, where inadvertent doping would be an issue, and all those types of things. Ideally, you are choosing electrolytes that are batch tested for the main reason that, number one, they're multi-ingredient, so that increases the risk straight away. But also they're often packaged with other sports foods and sports supplements, which again increases the risk again because there's that inadvertent doping of a small amount of banned substance getting into the package of electrolytes. So just keep that in mind. Definitely worthwhile going for a third-party batch tested option if you can. There's plenty out there. It doesn't really limit your options too much in terms of what you recommend to your clients or your athletes, but definitely makes a big difference to just reducing that risk again of that inadvertent doping. And I think lastly, what was I going to say lastly? Oh, yeah. Do you know what happens? I think there's a real issue with clients not understanding the difference between sports drinks and electrolytes. And I don't know if everyone else comes across it as well, but I definitely have conversations more often than I would expect on saying they're having sports drink, but they're actually having electrolytes, or having electrolytes and thinking they're doing sports drink, as a summary. So making sure that your clients that you're talking to, when you're asking around hydration, electrolytes, sports drink, really making sure you're clarifying what you mean by those and the difference between the two, of when to use electrolytes, when to use sports drinks, what each is for and why they're different, so that you're not missing an opportunity accidentally to fuel and hydrate, or just hydrate, because that can be something that is really confusing for the general population. And I think, we know this stuff, we're within this stuff every day, but electrolytes and sports drink are really similar in the heads of our clients. We need to make sure we break that down and be really clear about what we want them to be having for hydration, or what's going to be best for them in those moments, versus just saying a word and hoping they know what it is. Because I have definitely come across some endurance athletes, as an example, who thought they were fueling and hydrating with their sports drink, but were actually having electrolytes. So, a no sugar hydration in many ways. So just be really, really aware, have that in your on your radar when you're talking to people. And then I guess to finish off, in terms of hydration and improving that in a client, I think the biggest thing with hydration is that most of the people we work with they already know that hydration is important. They already know they probably should drink more water. It's about working through why they're not currently doing that. And that's why I think electrolytes are utilized and enjoyed by many, because they do find that it helps them hydrate better. And I've mentioned this earlier in our chat, but I just thought I'd touch on it in the behavior lens. Because when we're having this, so often we're like, well, we need to drink this, and we need to, have a drink a glass of water at each meal and snack and rah, rah, and this is how much per day. And we kind of start prescribing amounts per day. But what we actually need to do is seek the why behind it, of like, why aren't you currently meeting your hydration demands? Why are you currently maybe relying on electrolytes, if that's the case as well? So you can then problem solve with them, alongside making sure that we continue to keep hydration feeling really easy, low friction, and also really enjoyable. So, things like adding berries, citrus, ice, carbonated options, alongside flavored teas, those types of things can be really, really beneficial without increasing that sodium. Because high sodium intake does have its risks. And I was saying to Kirsten this morning when we were chatting through this session, I find it really intriguing that at a population level, we've spent so much time talking around the risks of a high sodium diet in terms of processed foods, alongside things like additions of salt and those types of things. And that has one side to it. But hydration market in the electrolyte sense seems to be, greenwashed in how healthy it is and how good for it is us is. But some of them are such high sodium concentrations that I really I am concerned with how often they're being used by some individuals, for sure. I think they definitely have a place. I am really glad they exist. I use them often with my athletes and my clients for various reasons that we've gone through. But to rely on them just to make drinking water more fun and enjoyable, I think is just this little bit of, okay, we can do that now and again, but what else are we going to do? What other strategies can we add in so it's not just this? And particularly if the client of yours is also doing that with their children. Because again, we've got really high sodium intakes coming through for kids and adolescents through these drinks, but also the B6 in some of these drinks is beyond a child's RDI, just in one drink and one serve. So there's a few things definitely to consider. You can be the advocate, you can be the knowledge, you can be the empowerer of improved behavior, without necessarily being the taking away of these things that are actually working, or they're enjoying. So I hope this helped. Does anyone have any questions or things they'd like to ask in this space? And sorry about moving both screens. I'm on Instagram and I'm also on Zoom. Awesome. Fabulous team. Well, if that's the case, I reckon we can finish up for today, and hopefully you found that useful. Obviously, if you think of questions later, please shoot them through via our email or on our Instagram. You can chat to us anytime. Oh, that was some great insight and reminders of these key points. Oh, thank you so much for that feedback. That's really lovely. Oh, sorry, I just noticed there was a chat. Oh, thank you. And thank you, Rach. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found this useful. Electrolytes are a really funny thing. I really think I might release a range because the hydration market seems to be quite the thing. Was wondering about the home sweat testing patch, test patch. Oh my God, let me try again. Was wondering about the home sweat patch testing. Yes, so again, user error is a really big thing here that can change the result. And so you need to work through, do I really need it? Is it worth the investment? Will I get better buy-in from my client by doing this? Will it be an insight of data that will actually change what I do? And just weighing that up, if you feel like it's an actual really important data point to the particular sport or event they're doing, I would pursue it and just have it as a really subjective measure and appreciate the error that might be within that. But if you find it insightful and you want to go through with it, absolutely. But I would say it's a very rare occurrence in the way that I practice, just because I think I've witnessed so much around the error, the lack of evidence around actioning it, and instead just really listening to the client and acting upon their varying hydration strategies instead. So yeah, I think user definitely insights and trust your practitioner brain. But yeah, I would say it's quite a rare thing to go with. Next question. I just wanted to ask quickly about the front loading with ORS, so oral rehydration solutions, in the context of preventing potential heat injury in hot environments for military personnel like in Townsville and Darwin. Yes, so if you've got heavy sweaters, number one, this hyperhydration can absolutely be something that you trial and work through to see if it works for them. But also in really high risk environments, hyperhydration can be something to consider as well. Now, oral rehydration solutions in the sodium context of how much they have aren't enough to do that full hyperhydration protocol. So you would generally need to add some sodium alongside that to hyperhydrate. But in terms of preparing for those on a general sense and just being hydrated and well hydrated, they can absolutely help. The other thing to consider with hyperhydration is the inclusion of glycerol as well. So there's a couple of things to consider, but I would say yes, hydrating well with the help of oral rehydration solutions is definitely worthwhile and worth considering in those types of circumstances where there is a high risk environment. Oops. Thanks, guys. Any other questions? Thank you so much for coming along. It's been really nice to chat through this and a little bit more science than my usual sessions lately. So that was good. Brilliant. Thanks so much, guys. Have a wonderful Thursday Arvo. If you're in Australia. If you're not in Australia, have a great Thursday. And we'll chat really soon. Thanks, guys. Bye.